3PLs hide their real cost in ways most founders never catch. If you're overpaying your 3PL right now, you're not alone. There's a specific process to fix it. I'm your host, Matt Lady. I do e-commerce marketing at Client Boost. Today, I'm talking with Keyan Bazargan, founder of Iron Margin, who set up 8 fulfillment centers in 1 year and learned exactly how 3PLs bury fees in rate cards, contract terms, and invoice line items that seem normal, but actually aren't. In this episode, you'll learn the exact questions to ask to uncover these hidden costs, why getting rate comparisons is the fastest way to save around 10%, and the 3 things you can do this week to stop overpaying. Let's get into it. What is the fastest way, in one sentence, a early stage brand around 10 million in revenue to claw back 10% in logistics without hurting customer experience? How can brands start to optimize this often viewed as a cost center for their business?
Definitely. In one sentence, I would say get rate comparisons, meaning reach out to dozens of companies and see what your market value is.
Killer. That's a great starting point. So when you're considering these rate requests, the comparisons, these brands often already have a 3PL, but they just maybe picked one in the past. They got a referral from a friend. They're looking to shop around. What are the few metrics or main things you should look at to even determine if you should shop around or if you should consider switching?
Yeah, I would say starting with like less metrics, but more intangibles. Like, is your 3PL working hard to get you better rates? Because they have their own work to do, which is they need to be good at negotiating better rates with the carriers themselves so that they can pass on more savings to you. So that's like an intangible. It's not necessarily a metric. And then just secondly, just getting a pulse check of, is the ownership group and my reps at this 3PL, do they actually have my best interest in mind? Or is my contract more predatory and that kind of thing? So those aren't really data points, but that's really the first thing I'd look at. And then if you are on the side where you don't feel like you have full transparency or trust, you don't feel like your 3PL is getting you better rates, then you're going to want to look at things like, what's your average shipment cost, just like in aggregate? What is it for your specific SKUs, and kind of slice and dice the data. Just like one quick anecdote, a founder had tweeted recently that they were using a 3PL that charged them like a certain dollar amount, and they saw just through Shopify's out of the box rates that they were way cheaper through Shopify. And so he asked his 3PL, can we use these rates? And they basically said no. And if you're a 3PL and your rates aren't even beating the Shopify rates and you're forcing them to use your rates, then you're really screwing over your customer. So you need to either, get better rates, or you need to allow them to bring in your own rates until yours are competitive. That's how I view it.
That's huge. That's a good red flag to kind of be aware of. A quick follow-up on the first 2 intangible points that weren't metrics, but still important, obviously. How can you tell? How do you understand? Are they working hard for me? Like, what are the questions you're asking? What's the process there besides hiring you? Like, what can someone do on their own?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I'm thinking back to when I kind of started my career and when I was a little bit more naive in evaluating 3PL. So for the last company I worked for, we were expanding internationally and we set up 8 fulfillment centers globally within the span of a year. So we got like a good mix of, very high quality 3PLs and some that weren't as high quality, because our expansion strategy was so quick. We didn't have a ton of time to do this whole evaluation period. And it can be very hard to tell. I think if I could go back in time to when I was in that position, I would have relied a lot more heavily on referrals versus just kind of like Google search and seeing who comes up and getting connected with someone that you don't know. I think there's a lot of high trust people in the industry who you just need to talk to other brands, talk to people like who don't have a financial incentive. So one thing that, I've done, like my business is not to necessarily recommend 3PLs, but it comes up from time to time. I've intentionally I don't want to take any money for getting referrals, because I want like my word to be, kind of clean in terms of, giving referrals to businesses. So I would say rely heavily on referrals and try and learn what's going on yourself. And when you get rate cards, don't just accept it for what it is. That's also where the comparisons can come to mind. You need to be a curious person and ask questions, and don't be afraid to ask, financial related questions about how the rate card works, about their incentives. Try and get a sense of how open and transparent they are.
Yeah. No, that's awesome.
So,
Last follow up on this one is does that come in the contract and the scope of work at all? Is it like the any standard level agreements, like any guarantees, any minimums, any like contract length of time?
sure.
And then also when you're looking for referrals, is it certain 3PLs? They're better at certain verticals, categories, those that sort of thing too. Just wanted to
Sure.
touch on that.
Definitely. Yeah. So, on the first point, when it comes to your contract, fun fact, the best 3PL that I ever worked with did not have us on any contract. There was no commitment. They said they had so much confidence in their service that there was no minimum terms. And then there's a few of the like bigger players out there who I've seen like really long contracts, like 3-year terms. And I've thought, especially for shipping locked in contracts, like that's way too long. So much can change in shipping. I think the standard that I've seen is not really like locking you into a shipping contract. And then fulfillment, like I can understand a bit more because there's more onboarding costs for a fulfillment center to take you on. And if it takes a few months to onboard you and you have a lot of SKUs and your business is complex, then I can totally understand like a 1-year agreement. So it really depends. The more complex your business on the fulfillment side, definitely a 1-year contract I think makes sense and is fair to the 3PL. In shipping, I would say don't try and ever sign any contract.
Yeah, no, makes sense. Thanks for
Yeah, and
breaking that
then
apart.
yeah, you can you repeat your second question actually?
Yeah, just when you were asking about referrals in terms of the 3PL recommendations, do
Mhm.
you care about the industry, the vertical, the size at all when you're talking to these other brands? Does that matter a lot or not?
I'd say it's not like the biggest thing. There's a lot of 3PLs that can handle all sorts of products, but there are cases where specialty matters. For example, apparel, like with the high SKU count and the complexity in certain industries, it can be helpful to have someone who's just like focused on apparel or has done a ton of apparel and has brand names that you know. Similarly, like with big and bulky packages, sometimes it makes sense if you really want to cut down those shipping costs and you're like a bigger brand to have work with a 3PL that has multiple nodes. So you can kind of cut down on shipping costs. So there's a couple cases where it matters, but I wouldn't say it's like the number one thing that I look for.
So you mentioned earlier that you had the 8 fulfillment centers in a year and that some were good, some were bad, and just like not enough. There's a lot to do in a little amount of time. So if in a perfect world, what would be like the right amount of time to evaluate a 3PL, and what are those kind of factors and standard things you're looking at to determine who's the best fit for your brand at that time?
Yeah, I would say at least 1 to 2 months from the moment you make contact with them to when you actually onboard. And then some of the characteristics that I'd be looking for is first, you're starting out with kind of a general conversation. You're getting a sense of like what their rate card looks like, the services they offer, kind of like the general stuff there. And then as you get more serious with like a couple of the top contenders, I would highly recommend, especially, if you're like a medium-sized business and even for some small-sized businesses to justify the cost of actually visiting the warehouse in person. That's something that I didn't get the opportunity to do for a couple cases, but then a few later on, I was able to visit in person. And I think it makes a big difference just in terms of one, you can see is the warehouse clean? What types of stuff are they moving? Could you imagine your product being stored here and delivered from here? I think it's definitely worth it to actually do that.
When comparing, say you had those couple initial conversations, you start
hmm
narrowing it down, you
hmm
get to say final 2 or 3. How are you advising people to, or even yourself when you're doing it with brands as a partner, comparing the two? Is it just cost? What other factors are kind of involved here?
Yeah, I would say with fulfillment, cost is a lot less important than shipping costs. Like just because shipping's a larger line item typically for most brands, fulfillment, I'd say you really want to focus on quality. And if you're down to 2 or 3 and you think that, they're all, all these final 3 have, great quality, like with all of them, we're really not going to be able to tell until we actually onboard. I think you have to have a little bit of gut involved and just get a sense of like, is this business stable? Are they going to be around for 5 to 10 years? Is the founder passionate? What's the ownership structure like? Getting into these questions where instead of thinking about what does my next year look like and what cost savings are there, but really switching to that mindset of like, is this a person that I want to be an extension of my business for the next 5 to 10 years? That's what I would say.
Huge perspective shift on the long term there. That's really important. It's often viewed as a cost center only, but it really is the experience that the brand customers, it's the experience that customers receive. It's
Yeah.
extension of the business. That's a great way to put it. So just wanted to reiterate that. So moving on, you picked a 3PL and you onboarded with someone. Just wanted to kind of narrow in a little bit more on a term a lot of people use is true landed cost, and then understanding what that is and understanding what that is. We'll start there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so landed cost, I think there's a couple different ways people will define it. One is the cost for it to land at your warehouse, and the other is the cost for it to land at your customer's door. I typically just bake everything into one final number, which is like essentially a cost of goods sold number. Although I understand if the term is landed, I understand why, people would define it the other way. But to come up with that number, like it's basically a lot of components of your cost of goods sold. Not everything. For example, like I don't think you'd want to include like processing fees in your landed cost. Maybe that's something that's in your cost of goods sold, but not in your landed cost. So landed cost is definitely going to make up your manufacturing cost. It's going to make up your tariffs if you're manufacturing from overseas. It's going to make up your freight. And depending on how you define it, well, it's definitely going to include that leg from the port to the actual warehouse. And then from there, some people might say, okay, that's our landed cost. Other people might throw in then the pick, the pack, maybe a month storage on average, and then the shipping for like a all-in kind of landed cost.
And is that a metric that you advise people to look at? Is that not as important? Is it the parts is more important than the whole? What's the difference there? And like, are there any hidden fees or kind of things that may move the margin more important than others?
Yeah, I think at a high level, your cost of goods sold matters. So like when I think about an e-commerce business, not really thinking about LTV too much. I know LTV is very important, but like on that first order, you have your average order value, which you want to increase as much as possible. You have your customer acquisition cost, which you want to decrease as much as possible. And then cost of goods sold, where supply chain people are focused, you also want to decrease that as much as possible. So the reason why I kind of earlier said, fulfillment, the pricing doesn't really matter is because compared to your manufacturing costs, your tariffs, and your shipping, it's just not a big percentage of your cost of goods sold. And so when I advise brands on calculating that first, like simple, like, Excel line item, figure out what your actual costs are, which a lot of people will get wrong because they don't have all the data from their vendors. It's actually very hard to have a true understanding of your costs. But assuming you do, or at least you have a rough idea, then you can see, well, what's more realistic? Can I shave $1 off my manufacturing? Can I shave $1 off my freight? Can I shave $1 off shipping? And what I've realized with doing that analysis so many times is that last mile shipping is the category where you can get the most gains for the least amount of like time and effort. Like often it's a lot harder. Imagine you're like you're a sock company, you're producing socks, and it costs you like a buck or two to manufacture, but it costs you $5 or $6 or $7 to ship it direct to consumer. It's a lot easier to shave a quarter off of that shipping than it is to shave a quarter off your manufacturing costs. It's case dependent, but I've made that observation that shipping is definitely a line item that a lot of brands can save with like in a couple weeks or a month kind of thing.
Awesome. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. That example was obvious to me. So thanks for sharing
Yeah.
that one. Obvious in a good way of like, wow, yeah, shipping is really important in a lot of those cases. So when you get started with this 3PL, how can brands do their side of the partnership? How can they be a good partner to the 3PL? What do they need to be aware of that the 3PL may or may not tell them? Like what's implied versus what's like best practice? How can they help their 3PL help them?
Definitely. Yeah. This is something that I have more empathy for now than I used to because I'm not on the brand side anymore, and I have more empathy and understanding of kind of both sides of the negotiating table. I'd say like the first thing is understand that your EPL has their own profit and loss that they need to take care of the same way you do. If you have a partner that is working hard to improve your costs over time, or they're giving you high quality service, especially on fulfillment, like I wouldn't make a switch for short term savings in a year. If you really do the math, like you might lose money like trying to make a switch. Even if there's savings on like a spreadsheet, you might lose money going through the headache of actually doing the switch. And then oftentimes when new 3PLs are quoting you out, it might seem better than it actually is. And then so then when you receive your next invoice at the new 3PL, like it turns out maybe you didn't save any money and you went through 6 months of headache. So I would say like if a 3PL is treating you well, give them loyalty. That's the first thing. And understand that, fulfillment, pick and pack, like this stuff costs real money, real labor, and it's not necessarily the place I would nickel and dime on. Like I wouldn't try and go to my 3PL all the time and say, "Hey, we need to shave from 150 down to 140." I would more so approach these conversations as a strategist and talk about these things together, and ideally have a partnership where there's a lot of trust and openness with each other.
That's really helpful. What can someone expect in terms of communication or reporting or meetings or updates with the 3PL? This scenario we've been talking about, it's they already had one and there's transitioning, but if you're just having a 3PL for the first time, people
Yeah.
may not know this. So just would love to kind of hear what your expectations are, what a good scenario and setup is.
Definitely. Yeah, I'd say I've seen it work where people have an account rep dedicated to you, like in a Slack channel, or they're just really responsive on email. Or then some of the smaller ones, like, might literally be like, you can call or text my cell phone whenever you want. And all those can work. They should be communicating with you as much as like an internal team member would. I would say I would have concerns if you're working with somebody who takes more than, I'm a little stricter on this, but I'd say like more than a day. I personally would want responses or at least confirmation that you've received my response within a day, right? I'm not saying you need to solve my problem within a day, but that's part of communication is to like make sure I'm kept in the loop or help me set my own expectations. And I've worked with some 3PLs where you'll send a message out, you won't get a response for 2 to 3 days. Then you have extra work yourself now to like, you have to remind yourself, I need to follow up with them, or you start to wonder, why haven't they gotten back to me? And that extra communication burden is real cost to you, to your ops team, to your customer support team. And then obviously if a fulfillment center can be more tech forward and solve a lot of problems without you having to reach out, then that's great as well.
Awesome. Let's start winding down here. In terms of you've been with this new 3PL you've picked for a while, you're starting to be like, cool, we got everything up and running, we're onboarded, things are pretty smooth. What is a few things on the shipping side that brands may or may not know about that you can ask the 3PL about, or that you should be expecting to hear from them of like, cool, these types of orders, we can do this, or we can try out this other carrier. What are some of those tips and tactics to kind of optimize the shipping side?
Definitely. Yeah, I think a lot of 3PLs don't necessarily want to be transparent on the shipping side because it's a big cost center for them. And a lot of brands don't really understand how it works. So they don't quite ask the right questions to create the conversation. But some ways that you as a brand can approach your 3PL to lower your costs is one thing you could do is discuss the packaging and the weights and dims. So you can ask, hey, given the rate cards that you have with us, how can we package our, let's say they have bundle orders, right? Where the average order has 3 items. You can ask them questions like, hey, does it make sense to ship out this 10-pound and this 20-pound box as two separate ones? Or would it be better if we actually repackaged it into one 30-pound box? Can you help us run an analysis? Oftentimes, these types of savings have to be done internally by the team because a 3PL is not necessarily going to help you with that. But if a 3PL is willing to help you with that, that's great. And then the second thing I would do is ask them about different carriers. So obviously, there's UPS, FedEx, and USPS who are doing most of the volume, but ask them about, can we use DHL or Amazon or regional carriers like OnTrack, UniUni, VHO, GLS, and would any of them be a good fit to help me reduce costs? And even just opening up that conversation, they might find a helpful solution for you.
Awesome. Sweet. So last one here is what's like 3 things people can do this week or next week to improve their shipping economics, or they're reviewing their 3PL and kind of the ops side of things about what we talked about today.
Definitely. First thing you should do is download your most recent invoice from your shipping carrier or 3PL and spot check things. So filter by different weights and dimensions and see, what is it actually costing me to ship? Does this match up with what I thought? Because you might find invoice errors, which is not uncommon. So that's the first thing I would do. The second thing I would do is ask your 3PL about what other shipping options are available. And then the third thing I would do is, on your own, try and get an understanding of what your rates could or should be. So I would, look up a list of all the different shipping carriers there are domestically in the US and potentially get rate comparisons from those folks.
Killer. Awesome. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. We'll have you back on for future episodes to kind of keep going through our series we planned out.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks. Bottom line, shipping costs are often easier to optimize than manufacturing, and most brands are leaving thousands on the table every month by not getting rate comparisons and getting stuck in long-term contracts. Thanks to Keyan for breaking down the real economics of 3PL partnerships. Please leave me your feedback, what topics you want to see more of, and if you're interested in being a guest on the show to dive deep and narrow on a subtopic in e-commerce for 7 and 8 figure brands, let me know. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you on the next one.